No mercy.
Shields up! Advance!
Come on!
Hello everyone and welcome to the Wirral. Now I've come here today to look at something which has fascinated me for ages, and it's not boats. Look at that boat there. It's not boats or shipping, and it's not the industrial guts of Liverpool or Birkenhead. It's something much older than that, and arguably more important. Now when you think of the great battles of British history, you might think of the Battle of Hastings in 1066, or that time Robert the Bruce sent the English packing at Brunanburh. You might even think of Marston Moor, when the parliamentary forces kicked out the royalists from the north of England and made the reputation of Oliver Cromwell the only head of state we've ever had who wasn't royal. But what if I told you that a battle had taken place over a century before Hastings? A battle not over England, but a battle that made England, that solidified this tiny fragile country still in its infancy. So this was the Battle of Brunanburh, fought in the year 937, not between 2 or 3, but 4 powerful kings of the British Isles. And it was essentially a battle over who would control northern England, those to the south or those to the north. So I'm stood here in the mud on the edge of the Wirral because this is where it's supposed to have happened. The problem is, nobody really knows for sure. Right, so this is Brackenwood Golf Course in Bebington on the Wirral, and the current consensus picks out this site, or this area around here, as the site of the battle between these two massive armies. So, somewhere around this location was where these kings, these assorted kings, decided to have the battle that would settle all scores. But on the other hand, a dozen sites around Britain have been proposed as the site of the Battle of Brunanburh. So, in truth, where was it? Well, spoiler alert, I don't know, and this video isn't going to tell you either, because nobody really knows for sure. But I still wanted to look at this battle in history. I still wanted to look at the evidence of where it could have been. This big decisive battle that made England. The historical context for the battle is quite important, starting way back when the Roman armies left Britain in the 5th century and invading groups rushed to fill the void. The majority were the Angles, the Jutes and the Saxons, from modern day Denmark, the Netherlands and northern Germany. And they fought against Celtic Brittonic people who inhabited Britain before the Romans. The newcomers began to settle and establish kingdoms across Britain, leaving just the extremities of the island unconquered. What is today Scotland and Ireland and much of Wales remained free. The kingdoms they set up were not peaceful. Established by powerful warlords, each fought bitterly against their neighbours. The border between the kingdoms of Mercia in the Midlands and Northumbria to the north was constantly shifting. This entire area frontier territory where frequent skirmishes and raids would happen. Of all of the settlements in the north, the heavily fortified town of York was the most important. The capital of Northumbria, it was also one of only a handful of places left in Britain with solid Roman remains, and one of the first places the Anglo Saxons sought to occupy. To control York was to control the majority of northern England. By the 9th century, more warlords across the sea had set their sights on Britain for potential riches. Amassing vast armies, several set sail for the islands, at first raiding and then eventually settling. The new arrivals were very much the same people as the old arrivals had been, and worshipped the original pantheon of gods, led by Odin. However, the Saxons of Britain had now largely converted to Christianity, considering paganism with disdain. As the Danish forces pushed southwards against the Saxon kings, the clash of Christianity and paganism made diplomacy incredibly difficult. So the Danes actually pushed the Saxons right back to virtually nothing, forcing the last Saxon king, Alfred, to hide in the swamps and marshes down in Somerset. And it was only from there that he managed to assemble this last-ditch army of mostly peasants to fight the great heathen army of the Northmen. And he actually defeated them at Ethandun in 871. A line of truce was established across the country, running from London to roughly Chester, with the north falling under Danelaw. After Alfred's death, his son Edward and daughter Aethelflaed took advantage of weakened Mercia and took control of most of southern England, eventually establishing Wessex power as far north as Chester and the Wirral. The dream now was to unite all the former Saxon kingdoms under one ruler, but it was a fight that would take many generations. At the same time, Norse raiders had gained control of disparate parts of the Western British Isles, including many Scottish islands and parts of Ireland, founding Dublin amongst others. Meanwhile, mainland Scotland had been establishing its own identity. A complex melting pot of Gaels, Picts, Christians and Norse pagans, Scotland had largely begun the process of unification under King Constantine. There was also the region of Strathclyde in the lowlands, a relic of pre-Roman Britain that had come and gone over the years. In 927, King Alfred's grandson Aethelstan had ascended to power and consolidated Saxon control over most of modern-day England, or Angleland. Documents like this one here have a list of names of other kings, lords and ealdormen who swore to live peacefully under Aethelstan's hegemony, including Halfdan, and Uhtred of Bebbanburg, the Saxon lord of northern Northumbria. Although the other kingdoms were acting as vassal states, peace with Constantine seems to have been shaky, and in 934 Aethelstan led an army into Scotland, perhaps as a punishment for breaking a treaty, perhaps with intention to push his kingdom northwards. Eventually Constantine relented and sued for peace, and was one of 5 kings present in Cirencester to formally sign allegiance once again to Aethelstan's rule. In 937 then, Constantine allied himself with King Owain of Strathclyde and Anflaf of Dublin, seeking to force the Saxons out of Northumbria and crush Aethelstan. Anflaf himself could claim the throne of Northumbria ahead of Aethelstan. So these allied forces of Scots, Irish, Norse, Danish and Northern British all travelled overland and by sea, assembling the biggest fleet ever seen in British waters until that time, 650 warships. According to some historical sources, the people of Northumbria largely welcomed the allied forces. And of course many Danes in the army would have been recruited straight from Northumbria itself. There's evidence suggesting that Aethelstan was late in responding to the invasion, perhaps a signal that he was gathering as large a force as possible before riding north to face this vast allied army. Finally, the dawn broke and the two sides met shield wall to shield wall at last. Fighting in a shield wall was horrible business. The men on the front line had to hold their formation tight and try to hack at their opponents with short swords and knives, all the while trying not to get stabbed themselves, both overhead and down around their feet. The men in the second rank would hold their shield high, protecting the men in front from above, but they'd also be attacking enemies with swords and spears, going for weak spots in the neck or the ankles. So you can imagine this kind of tight, claustrophobic crush, the gritted teeth, the grunting and the heaving, and both sides pushing into each other. And then you've got the smell of that battlefield, the mud, the blood, the sweat, the feces and the urine. Now, apart from the weapons, to survive a shield wall, men needed 2 things: the stamina to keep pushing and keep fighting, and 2, the luck not to get hit, to stay out of harm's way longer than your opponent. According to the Anglo Saxon Chronicle, written 20 years after the battle had lasted all day, the Saxons eventually splitting the shield wall, and hewed battle shields with the remnants of hammers. There lay many a warrior by spears destroyed. Splitting the shield wall not only disrupted the Allied defensive line, but it caused a huge drop in confidence. Eventually the army began to scatter. Aethelstan and his army pursued the invaders until the end of the day, hewing the fugitive grievously from behind with swords sharp from the grinding. The chronicle states that Constantine escaped to Scotland and that Anflaf and his remaining men departed in nailed ships and sought Dublin over the deep water, leaving Dignismere to return to Ireland ashamed in spirit. And there were never yet as many people killed before this with sword's edge, since from the east Angles and Saxons came up over the broad sea. The Battle of Brunanburh is mentioned or alluded to in over 40 Anglo-Saxon, Irish, Welsh, Scottish, Norman and Norse medieval texts. Yet these brief summaries don't really tell us much about what happened, the details. In fact, even the basics are often elusive, the location of the battle being a primary example. The site of the battle is referred to as Bruna, Brunandun, Brunanburh, Brunanburh, Brunanwerk, Bruneford, Duinbrunde, Browningfeld, which all contain a variation of Brun, likely a personal name, or could be the Old Norse word for spring or stream. Other sources call it Wendun, the plains of Othlin, Vinheithre, and Venus Korga. Which I think you'll agree isn't a lot of help, particularly because so many place names have changed over the past 1,000 years. Now the problem here isn't just that the evidence disagrees, it's that it has varying degrees of reliability. Some written accounts were written years or decades after the battle, some were written centuries afterwards, so how reliable actually are they? So the idea that the battle took place on the Wirral is based on a lot of circumstantial evidence, the most obvious being that Brunanburh is the only place name in Britain which is remotely similar to Brunanburh.
The Wirral had a large Norse population from the early 900s, and were mostly a peaceful community living on the remote part of what was then Mercia. Archaeological digs, deep dives into the historical record, place names, and even DNA show that the Wirral had a large Norse community that lasted for several centuries. It seems obvious that an army from Dublin would cross the sea and hit land somewhere so close, establishing themselves in a place where they wouldn't be opposed, and within a day's ride of the important Mercian town of Chester. From here they could raid deep into either region. And finally, the reference to them fleeing by Dingesmere is now thought to be a reference to Thingwall on the Wirral. Mere meaning sandbank, and Dinges possibly coming from the word Thing, which was a place where the Norse community had their councils. In that case, then Anflaf would have landed on the south side, using the Dee, and marched east to the battle site. One account of the battle is Egil's Saga, about a famous Icelandic chieftain who fought alongside Aethelstan's forces at Brunanburh. Written a couple of centuries after, it described how the battle site was heathland next to a woodland. Brackenwood Golf Course sits on what was once natural heathland, with Stourton Woods just to the north. The fort at Brunanburh, originally built by the Saxons, would have been a prominent enough landmark to stage a battle nearby.
Okay, so I'm on the Dee side of the Wirral Peninsula now, so the southwest of the peninsula if you like, and this is roughly the closest you can get from the river to the settlement of Thingwall. Now there are a few problems with the Wirral being the site of Brunanburh, and this is one of them. As you can see, it's very muddy here, and although this would have changed over the last 1,000 years, the Dee has always been a very muddy, sandy place. This isn't even a river, this is just a little trickle. The river's actually over there beyond the marshes that way, quite a distance away. So if you wanted to bring a fleet of 650 warships down here, you'd have trouble. This wouldn't be an ideal site to come, knowing that they could very easily get stuck and grounded.
Second is that if the battle was supposedly fought in October, November or even December, then why was Anflaf's arrival in Dublin not mentioned in Irish sources until after Easter? Dublin is just over a day's sailing across the Irish Sea from the Wirral. Thirdly, a lot of historical sources mention Anflaf getting the support of Northumbrian Danes before attacking into Mercia. And anyone who wanted to dominate Northumbria usually had to assert their presence in its capital, its one major city, which was York, all the way over here. Finally, a few sources mention the fleet of Norse ships entering the River Humber, which is all the way over here, and granted access to not only York, but the main artery of military travel back in the day, this line here. This is the Great North Road, or at least a vague early version of it. Today it's the A1, and it was the most common route of travel for armies heading from south to north, and vice versa.
But if it wasn't here, if it wasn't the Wirral itself, then where was it?
Of the many alternatives, one suggests it took place in Yorkshire, not far from York, the Humber and the Great North Road. And to see why, we have to look at one of the more obscure names the battle was given, by this guy, this historian Simeon of Durham. Simeon of Durham was writing his account nearly 200 years after the battle, and he used Brunanburh and Brunanburh alternatives. But he also used a third, Wendun, a dun meaning a prominent hill within a landscape. Not any hill, but somewhere that stands out far and wide. Although Wen could come from a lot of things, if we're sticking to geographical features, then we have the River Went, right over here just off the Humber.
And this is where Brunanburh's greatest asset, its name, might be its biggest undoing. Let me explain.
Today, historians tend to spell Brunanburh like this, which gives it the meaning Bruna's Fort. But remember, we got the name from the Anglo Saxon Chronicle, which spells it like this, with two N's. One version of it even has an extra N kind of added in there. Almost like the person writing this reread what they'd put and thought, oh no, I've missed a letter out. And that changes the meaning to fort by the spring or stream.
And then there's this Simeon of Durham guy who uses Brunanburh and Brunanburh alongside his Wendun. Double N's in both names.
So looking back over here near the River Went and the road, are there any prominent hills and springs in close proximity? Well, actually there is, right here. Historian Michael Wood reckons there's a good chance this area here, around an ancient natural spring known as Robin Hood's Well, was the real battle site. This was a place Northumbrians traditionally met southern rulers from the Dark Ages to the medieval period. It's got a hill and it's got a spring. But look back at Brunanburh and you also have a spring, St Patrick's Well. A spring turned into a well several hundred years before the battle. There's also a spring down here at Neston, next to somewhere called Windle Hill, a prominent hill in the landscape. Wirral archaeology are confident they found some promising evidence near Brunanburh, including artefacts like jewellery and weapons, so I'm hoping they'll find something definitive that might help locate the battle. But what that would be, and whether it would be conclusive enough, is a mystery in itself.
So there you go, the Battle of Brunanburh, the biggest battle in Britain before Hastings, a bloodbath in the north of England.
Aethelstan now considered himself the Rex Totus Britannia, the king of all Britain, but the battle had cost him so dearly that it virtually ended any ambition he had of conquering the whole of Great Britain. The strength of the Northern Alliance also went a long way to solidify the separate national identities that still exist in Britain even today. Brunanburh not only established an English identity, but a Scottish one too.
And one thing I always find interesting is that when the Normans invaded Britain in 1066 and defeated King Harold at the Battle of Hastings, famously catching an arrow in the eye apparently. Well, King Harold was the son of a lady called Gythia Thorkelsdottir, who was closely related to Canute the Great. And of course the Normans who eventually won in 1066 and defeated King Harold were from Normandy, so they weren't French, they were descendant themselves from Norse Vikings. So the Scandinavians won in the end anyway. And of course Hastings is always the defining battle of English history, but there wouldn't have been an England in the first place if it wasn't for Aethelstan's victory at Brunanburh. So yeah, right now I'm standing in England, but imagine if Aethelstan hadn't won that battle. I could be standing in Scotland right now. This could be Scottish territory, it could be Irish territory, it could even be Welsh territory where I am right now. Or it could be its own independent country of the north of England or whatever, with its own capital, instead of London, an independent capital in York or Manchester or Liverpool or Newcastle or wherever. Yeah, it's a good thought, it's a good thought. But anyway, thanks for joining me on this video. It's a bit detailed, but there's a big story, there's a big history to tell about this. So thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.